Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Outdoor Art Club presentation with Lisa Lord on conscious inclusion. I'm Jill Sampson, and I'm working with my fellow OAC member, Kate McCormick, to bring you this program. For those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we're a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. The club engages in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community, including presenting public programs like this one in our annual speaker series. This is a fourth season that our speaker series includes presentations on Zoom webinars, allowing us to reach a wider audience. Our speaker today is looking forward to answering your questions. Please put them into the Q&A, and Lisa will answer them either during or after the lecture. At this time, I would like to introduce Lori Howard, an OAC member and chair for today's event. Thank you so much, Lori, for bringing us this program.
Thank you, Jill. I'm delighted to introduce Lisa Lord. She's a dynamic and inspirational speaker and executive coach, and she developed her point of view initially as an executive in human resources working for Fortune 500 corporations. Her passion is rehumanizing the workplace, and that has led her to dive deep into often confusing waters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lisa, we're all very excited to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to share my deck with all of you so we can get started. Thanks so much for having me here. I wish I would say normally I'd like the weather out there, but today is a gorgeous sunny Philadelphia afternoon. So our topic today is conscious inclusion, and I want to just be clear what expectations I'm hoping you'll have for our time together today. And really, I am not expecting you to change your point of view completely or be completely influenced by me, though I'm open to that possibility. I really just want you to think of the fact.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Outdoor Art Club presentation with Lisa Lord on conscious inclusion. I'm Jill Sampson, and I'm working with my fellow OAC member, Kate McCormick, to bring you this program. For those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we're a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. The club engages in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community, including presenting public programs like this one in our annual speaker series. This is a fourth season that our speaker series includes presentations on Zoom webinars, allowing us to reach a wider audience. Our speaker today is looking forward to answering your questions. Please put them into the Q&A, and Lisa will answer them either during or after the lecture. At this time, I would like to introduce Lori Howard, an OAC member and chair for today's event. Thank you so much, Lori, for bringing us this program.
Thank you, Jill. I'm delighted to introduce Lisa Lord. She's a dynamic and inspirational speaker and executive coach, and she developed her point of view initially as an executive in human resources working for Fortune 500 corporations. Her passion is rehumanizing the workplace, and that has led her to dive deep into often confusing waters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lisa, we're all very excited to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to share my deck with all of you so we can get started. Thanks so much for having me here. I wish I would say normally I'd like the weather out there, but today is a gorgeous sunny Philadelphia afternoon. So our topic today is conscious inclusion, and I want to just be clear what expectations I'm hoping you'll have for our time together today. And really, I am not expecting you to change your point of view completely or be completely influenced by me, though I'm open to that possibility. I really just want you to think of the fact that we look at the world through a certain lens, and that lens is impacted by our entire lived experience, the world we come from, the people we surround ourselves with. And my hope today is that as a result of spending time together, like a kaleidoscope, you would have just shifted it a little and be looking at the same thing, but with potentially a different perspective. That's my hope, and that's my goal. And to get started, I really want to talk about bias and what bias is and understanding bias. And we hear a lot of this today, but as much as I know about bias, I learn more every single day. So I want to get us grounded on the same page before we keep diving into this subject of conscious inclusion. So what is bias? Well, first of all, if you're human and you have a brain, you have bias. It's inevitable. It exists in every one of us, and it's critical to ensuring our brain is able to function. How we define it is it's a disproportionate weight in favor of or against something or someone. And bias can often be intended to keep us safe. Maybe I have a bias for a certain kind of food. That could be a preference bias. Or I have a bias that people who graduated from a particular university might be more educated than someone who didn't. That's a bias. And now we're starting to get into how bias sometimes becomes judgment. But I'll get there in a minute. Bias is a natural survival mechanism. In reality, our brain actually processes, and this is going to blow you away, 11 million pieces of information every single second. Yes, I said 11 million every second. But remember what your brain is doing. Your brain is the mechanism that is managing all of your internal systems, your heart, your lungs, your nervous system, your endocrine system, everything inside. But your brain is also managing all of your emotions. It's managing everything you see. It's complete overwhelm to a brain to take in all that information. So what our brain has miraculously developed is a way to be able to take shortcuts, to be able to make things automatic so that you don't have to think about it. I mean, really, you don't have to think about breathing. You're probably doing it. You don't have to think about getting your heart to beat. It's already happened. But this same thing happens within our mind and our thoughts and our behaviors. It becomes automatic. If you drive a car, think about when you first learned to drive a car. It's overwhelming, all the information that's coming at you, how many mirrors you have to look in, what you have to pay attention to. But I bet if you've been driving for a while, you've had the experience of driving somewhere and arriving and saying, oh my gosh, I don't even remember the drive. Don't worry, it wasn't unsafe. Your brain was operating on automatic. That's your subconscious. Bias, it operates on an automatic knee-jerk reaction basis. It's automatic. It's programmed in from a really early age. So you're not paying attention and it's happening. So let me tell you how bias is formed. It starts from how we're conditioned. So everything starts from how we grow up. A lot of bias is established even at the very beginning of infancy. You can see an infant who cries, and then when a loved one comes close by, they're soothed simply by the comfort of a loved one. And they've learned, oh, if I cry, this person will come and comfort me. It's not like they went to school. We're talking about babies and infants. It's automatic. It's how the brain works. Think about what influenced your brain. Think about the bias that got programmed into your brain. Our bias comes from all these different social areas, from our family, our peer groups, our clubs and teams, our workplace, mass media, movies we watch, TV shows we pay attention to. They all condition our brains to expect something as normal and to be on guard when we experience something as not normal. I'll give you an example. If you think about back to kindergarten or first grade and some of the rules you learned when you first started in school, Probably you learned about sharing. You learned about using your inside voice. You learned to raise your hand before you speak. These are really typical rules established in a very American-oriented classroom. Now, are all classrooms like that? Well, not all people attend the same kind of classrooms. And so those rules that came into play, you now have a bias for that you want people to wait to be spoken until they're called upon, could be traced all the way back to your preschool or primary school experience. This is where bias gets formed. And remember, nobody gets away with surviving this life without bias. It keeps us safe in some ways. So maybe you're told, don't ever cross the street without looking both ways. You have a bias for safety. But if you were born in America, you're looking to the right and then to the left. And if you're in the UK, there's always a sign that says to look the other way. So their bias is different than ours. Okay, so you can see where all these things come from. And I want to advise you, if you have any questions, you can always add them in the Q&A. And I've asked Lori, if something comes up that's relevant, I'm happy to be interrupted for a question. All right, so if this is the conditioning we get, and that's bias, is that all we have to know about bias? And the answer is by no means. In fact, bias can be systemic. So we talk about how it's natural for yourself. It might exist in your family system, your peer system, your school system, your neighborhood. And you might think it's keeping you safe, but bias can also be part of a system. And it may not have been intentional, but it exists. So let me tell you the story of the Toronto Orchestra. Back in the 1970s, the orchestra realized they were having a very hard time attracting women to their orchestra. And there was a big women's movement, and Toronto decided we should do something about that. We should get more women to come. And they got women to audition, but they were never selected. So Toronto was the first orchestra that instituted blind auditions, kind of like The Voice that you see on television today. So people would go out on stage behind a curtain, and they'd be evaluated based on the quality of the music they produced, how they played it. And what they found was they got about a 25% increase in women being accepted into the orchestra. So clearly, bias was at play, even though they were hearing the same people. When they saw a woman playing, they weren't accepting as many. So great news, they had people come in, but they realized 25%, there's a lot more women auditioning, and we're still not bringing them all in. They discovered that when they asked people to remove their shoes, that it increased to 35 to 40% of the people who were accepted were women. Because when women were walking on the stage in high heels, it went click, clack, click, clack, and the men's shoes did not. So that's how deep the subconscious worked, that it was still had a bias against women and didn't even know it was functioning that way. Now, here's where the systemic continues to be a problem. Even after they did all of this, they still found they had no significant increase in the number of Black and brown musicians joining the orchestra. They weren't accepted at nearly the rate that they were available. However, there weren't as many available. So we have to look at what was the stream feeding the folks who went to auditions. Well, you go back and you look, it was famous music schools, Berkeley, Juilliard. These were places graduates had come. Well, guess who gets into those schools? People who have an advantage, who have been exposed to mentors and teachers who can teach them how to rehearse, how to apply, how to be accepted. And by the way, there's still bias going on in those schools. And then you get back to who was introduced to music, whose parents had music as part of their life, and who went through a classical training system. So the whole process of trying to improve the makeup of the Toronto Orchestra, while there were actions they could take, there was a systemic problem that remained unaddressed. Now, I get it. We can't fix everything all at once, one person at a time. But what I believe is that with awareness of bias, we start to see the systems that create bias, and we can potentially impact those systems simply by looking at our own bias. And just to let you know, here's what bias really does. It creates limitations. So here's how the brain works. We're taught what's normal. And when we experience something that's different from normal, our body signals, literally, it sends out nerve messages. Uh-oh, this is different. I'm uncertain. If what we see and experience is matching something we were taught to fear, or something we were taught to dislike, our body triggers judgment. If it's fear, we might mistrust, or we might be afraid, lock our doors, hold our purse tight, because we're seeing something we were taught was different, was not normal, and our brain thinks it's not safe. Now, the bad news is, if you just try to override your bias and you say, well, I know better, and now I'm walking through a neighborhood and I always hold my purse close, but I'm not going to lock the doors of my car just because I arrived at this part of town. Okay, well, you really can't override that bias because it's kind of like squeezing a balloon. You might want to feel like you're non-judgmental, but your body's still going to react with that mistrust if that's what you were taught. So it's going to pop out someplace else. So what I mean by squeezing a balloon is you might say, okay, I'm going to try really hard to be open to this new experience, but then you're going to have a great deal of frustration or anxiety with something else that you experience right away. So your body's not going to let you get away with just faking it. It's still going to react based on how it's programmed. And the programming has us gravitating towards things that make us feel more comfortable, things that make us feel more safe. We miss out on knowing people and experiencing food and life and culture that's different from what we've lived if we're constantly gravitating to what we already know or what we find as comfortable. It's limitations. And what people sometimes don't realize is that we're not trying to affect bias so that you can just treat other people better. It actually is limiting ourselves. Because when we put up a wall that says, this is not normal, or I don't trust that, or that woman's going wonko over something, and I'm going to stay away from her instead of feeling compassion and wanting to help. These are all things that we end up missing out on the potential to connect with someone. And I don't know about you, but all the research I'm finding today is that our country and the world is in a crisis of loneliness, and connection is something we could all benefit from. So our job then is to recognize that our bias is unconscious. It's that subconscious got there and didn't remember driving. And to know that it leads to exclusion of people, of data, possibilities, but exclusion is what limits possibilities for our connections to everyone else. So let's talk about how do we stop it? Because now that we understand what bias is, and we know it has a negative impact, how do we become what I call bias aware? And there's really two things we have to focus on in order to get there. The first is we've got to work to increase diversity in all of our life. And the second is we've got to ensure inclusion. So what do I mean by diversity? Well, we're going to stick on this slide for a little bit. I get it that it's really tiny, but let me talk about what I mean by diversity, because diversity comes in all forms and dimensions, and we tend to think of it in pretty limited aspects. But the fact is that we all have had different lived experiences. Think about it like if you live in a big city and you live in a high rise, you and your neighbors all have the same address. You just have different apartment numbers. And let's say you and your neighbor both live on the 4th floor. Well, that's right. We're in the same zip code, in the same building, and we're both on the 4th floor. But what's going on in our apartments is completely different. Okay, let's say you have a roommate and you live in the same apartment with another person. Does that make your experience the same? Of course not. You grew up in completely different ways. Take it all the way to the possibility of identical twins or triplets. I have triplets in my extended family, and they grew up exactly the same, going to the same schools, participating in the same clubs, but now they all live in different parts of the country. They had different interests, they had different desires. No two human beings are exactly the same. We're all different. And yet, simultaneously, genetically, we're all the same. So this diversity comes from our personality or internal dimensions like our age or our race or national ethnicity. It comes from our abilities, our physical and mental abilities. The concept of neurodiversity has been bantered about, and that's the idea that how people's minds work is different. So you see people on the autism spectrum. It doesn't make them less than, they just look at the world differently than. And we all do. But remember what I told you was the problem with difference and with bias? Difference disrupts by its nature. Our brain is looking for ways to categorize things and make things the same. And so if we experience something that's different, our brain's going to trigger a physical or an emotional response, that something's either wrong or uncomfortable or off. When in reality, it might not be. It's just the way we've trained our brain because of how we've lived. Now, really the key around diversity is learning how to deal with it, because that's what comes from becoming bias aware. And learning how to deal with diversity starts with understanding ourselves. So I want you all to think about, just for a second, if I asked you to describe to me, who are you? You'd probably tell me, well, you might tell me your gender. You might say you're female. You might say you're non-binary. I would tell you, I'm a woman. I'm a mother. I'm white. I'm middle-aged. Of course, I don't know what that means. You know, middle-aged, how long are we all going to live? But I identify as middle-aged. I'm from the East Coast. I'm Jewish. They're all parts of my identity. But there's other aspects to who I am. And depending on the circumstance I find myself in, other parts of my identity might be more important. So for the 2 years I lived in Germany, the fact that I'm American was a really salient part of my identity. Yet living here in the States, I hardly ever think about it unless I'm on an international call. And likewise, for many years, I identified first as a mother because I had young children. Well, I still identify as a mom, but my kids are off the payroll, they're young adults. So mother isn't as salient, it's not as immediate for me. I work in the human resource industry. That was part of my identity. So I knew other people in the human resource industry. And I also understood where my place was in that industry. These are all parts of my identity. Now, when we talk about diversity, we often think about the diversity you can see. And so for many male-dominated workplaces, you can see when you have females enter those workplaces or organizations. Somebody might stand out as different if they're not like whatever's dominant in that area. And for me, being a woman in a male-dominated workplace was significant, but being white was common. So I never had the experience of being a woman of color. And what did that feel like? What did that look like? That was different. And all these parts of our identity are how we see ourselves. And how we see ourselves establishes what our brain experiences as normal. And as soon as we see something that's different, our brain says, maybe that's not normal. Now, imagine how that feels if you're different and you're in an environment with people who all look like one another. Well, that's uncomfortable. But what if your difference isn't visible? What if it's a mental ability? What if I'm hearing impaired, which you may not know, how would any of you know, but I wear hearing aids and oftentimes people don't notice them. And I feel very different because people can hear one another when multiple conversations are happening at once and I can't. So I end up feeling excluded and they would never know because I look like them, I sound like them. There's no identifying way to know that I have something about me that's very different. So diversity it's about things you can count. So maybe you can't see them all, but if you were made aware of them, you could count these things. One of the authors I love in a TED Talk you might want to look at is Vernee Myers. And I'll share with Lori how to access that TED Talk. But she's a brilliant researcher, and she says diversity is like being invited to the party, but inclusion is like being asked to dance. And I say in the workplace, diversity is counting your people, and inclusion is making sure your people count. So let's look at inclusion. And I'm taking a breath in case Lori wants to interrupt with the question. Okay, so inclusion. So this is really an interesting part because you can have diversity and increase the diversity, try and attract people who are different, but if they don't feel included, if they don't feel seen and welcomed, you're never going to be able to maintain that diversity or get any benefit from it. And you have to feel physically and psychologically safe. And what I mean by psychologically safe is that you feel like you can bring your real self, your authentic self, your vulnerable self to the surface without risk of being alienated or embarrassed or humiliated. So sharing with you that I'm hard of hearing, some people are always surprised that I tell them. I'm like, well, I don't have any problem with it, but they see it as vulnerable. Or letting people in Germany, when I lived there, know that I'm Jewish. That was a little scary for me. That took a little courage. And inclusion is really about when courage is demonstrated, having it appreciated, not shocked. And inclusion is when bravery like that, speaking up, becomes normal. So I want to tell you about an organization that did incredible research, 10 years of research. You know the company, Google. They have this huge project called Project Aristotle. And they set out to discover what made the teams high performing. What did these highest performing teams have in common? And they had this hypothesis that what they had in common was diversity. But they wanted to check it out like any good scientist. It was a hypothesis. They were looking for data. And what their data found was that some of the high-performing teams were very diverse, and some of the low-performing teams were very diverse. So diversity wasn't the item that really said whether or not they were going to be high-performing. What they found was psychological safety, inclusion, that the differences were able to be shared and listened to. Now, here's the reality. Remember, our goal is to become aware of bias through diversity and inclusion. What Google taught us is with diversity and inclusion comes conflict. They watched their conflict numbers go up. They found with safety, people felt more respected and had more permission, so they shared what they were really thinking. And when we get to a place where we share what we're really thinking, all of a sudden that being asked to dance becomes stepping on someone's toes. And the reality is that's where innovation happens. That's where change happens. When we can surround ourselves with different points of view, different lived experiences, and value and welcome them in a place that allows for courage and bravery to happen on a regular basis, then what you find is we might disagree about an issue, but together we're going to come up with a better answer. So this is where the thought of inclusion becomes so important. And it's also where I want to make sure you all get an idea of what I mean about what being included feels like. So I'm going to play a short video. It's about 3 minutes long. That in the words of the people who felt excluded, what does inclusion mean to them? So give me just 1 second. Make sure everything's good. All right, you should be able to hear this.
There are people out there that would consider me, quote unquote, I hate this word, but a terrorist.
As an Indigenous person, you were known as somebody who potentially could be a drunk, have substance abuse issues.
Being Indian, they may have expected me to know a lot about computers.
It's sometimes a really unique experience navigating the world as a person with a disability who looks to be completely able-bodied.
He made a comment about, well, don't worry about this that's going on because you won't be here too much longer. You'll be off having your next baby soon.
Most women are, told they need to behave a certain way.
People really think that my generation is lazy.
Just another blonde waitress.
Hey, do you rap?
The only black girl.
I didn't belong.
I guess kind of growing up, people made these assumptions about what I was supposed to be, but it was really eye-opening for me to realize that I had been making those same assumptions myself.
We all like to think that we're inclusive, but sometimes we don't actually step back and think, wait a second, did I hear everybody in the room?
I mean, don't judge is the message, but it's also hard not to.
I always thought that every gay man was flamboyant and rude.
The older generation is set in their ways.
Initially, I thought there was something weird about a girl who would want to be a camera operator because of the word cameraman, and we still have to work past these things and stuff.
I went into the school on my first day, and there's these little girls, and they're wearing hijabs, and I was really intimidated by that.
Have your initial judgments, but also be willing to learn. My definition of inclusion is a world and a society in which constructed barriers have been torn down.
Inclusion for me is setting up an environment where everybody is comfortable.
Open to accept other people's opinions.
All individuals, regardless of their diversity, feel welcomed, feel respected.
It means that they don't have to try to be what others expect them to be.
Change is possible, but it takes the right person to make a change happen.
I had a shop floor supervisor who stood up for me and sent out a company-wide email saying that Robin has every legal right to use the women's change rooms. It's funny because you do find allies in some of the strangest places.
One thing we can do to support inclusion is to talk about it.
You have to demonstrate that you're committed to this.
Get to know people around you. Do something different, learn something different, learn about a culture.
Different races, different religions, different belief systems, and see what there's good in all those things.
Be an active listener. That's one of the things I practice with other immigrants as well.
Open up your mind and take your time and get to know someone. Instead of putting them in this box, just showing that interest, it's gonna surprise you.
Ask me a stupid question. I don't care if it's a stupid question, just ask me.
I'm an open book and willing to answer them.
I don't see it as a negative thing. I see it as a teachable moment.
Just ask me how to pronounce my name.
It's simple. You decide that other people's feelings and experiences matter.
We need to have more uncomfortable conversations so that we can drive more inclusion. And oftentimes, it's not easy.
And it's important, otherwise change will never happen.
My name is Shomudeep Ganguly, but people call me Sam.
I am Layla Karem.
Mutsa Matanga.
Ms. Geneviève Leblanc.
Ashley Pasila.
Patrick Duff. Neil McLaughlin.
Helena Gotchling.
Rod Bolger.
Jessica Shue.
Kazim Marcano. I'm a chef and I forge metals.
A proud mother.
Forklift operator and a truck driver.
I envision a day when we can just be so accepting of each other, where we can make space for others.
Okay, so I can't tell you how many times I've watched that video, and every time I'm impacted by it. And I think part of the reality is that some of the things they identified, I know I have thought or felt or wouldn't say out loud, but experienced. And so I want to tell you how important it is that we start with ourselves. And I'll just tell you a short story about myself. You don't really need to know me that well, but I think it's relevant to our discussion. And it emphasizes the fact that this isn't about other people, this is about us. And change starts with us. So for many years, I worked in human resources, and I was in charge of leadership development and culture organization development. I had a big job. I was also responsible for diversity and inclusion. And it wasn't until 2018, so we're talking pretty recently, when a biracial friend asked me to read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, that I realized I was holding all kinds of judgments that were impeding the success of people I had vowed and pledged to help advance in their careers. I'm running leadership development programs, and I'm not even seeing how my actions are harming, for me, most of the people I think I could have done better for were Black women. But regardless, they were harming other human beings. It's why when the Outdoor Club reached out to me and found that I have a mission to rehumanize the workplace so that all people are treated as people, this is where this story comes from. And I thought I was doing that work until I realized I am a white woman who has incredible privilege as a result of just being white in the world that I lived in. And I didn't realize the power that that holds, power that I didn't even know I could be using to support or to hurt someone. So I started having to look within, because this book opened my eyes, and maybe today's conversation has opened your eyes. And I started really digging into difference, and difference that I formed a judgment about. So I'll give you an example. I had a friend, a colleague, employee who worked for me from India. I did a lot of work with India. And I knew her marriage was an arranged marriage. And I remember, like, this is not Confessions Are Us, but I want to give you an example of how you can look at yourself. I remember thinking, oh my God, I can't believe she married someone she never met, like an arranged marriage. And my physical being actually felt like I was rolling my eyes or passing judgment. And I knew I was. And I didn't really see anything wrong with it. But one day I sat down with my friend and I said, you know, I know nothing about Indian culture. And I know you were in an arranged marriage. I would love to know more about how that worked for you. What was that like for you? What was great about it? What were the challenges with it? I'm just curious if you're willing to share. And she said, absolutely. You're the first person who's ever asked me that. And that kind of shocked me because what she was saying was, I was holding that judgment and never, ever questioning it. Remember that unconscious bias, become biased aware. Change begins with our own self-awareness. When we start paying attention to our own judgments, when we see or feel our inner reaction to put up a wall rather than extend an arm. If we're going to make bias more aware so that we can choose to introduce diversity and make sure people are included, we've got to remember it is human to be biased, but letting another person in by getting curious or sharing something about yourself is an act of vulnerability. And we've been taught in our biased world with our brain that tries to keep us safe, that extending ourselves in that way could be risky. So we don't think about the upside potential. That yes, it could be risky. I might be embarrassed if I raise a question about her arranged marriage. But the upside potential was I made a connection with her, which was far more authentic, far more meaningful, and far more personal. And she felt seen and valued and appreciated rather than judged. And just imagine the world if we simply made an effort to make new connections. Just imagine what that would be like. Now, I want to be clear, our brain protects us in the form of bias when we judge others, but one of the forms of bias that we never talk about is our own self-judgment, how we judge ourselves. Like, I don't know about you, but as a woman in this country, I know when I go to the beach, okay, like I said, way too much vulnerability. When I go to the beach, I notice the women in bathing suits and think, oh, I think I look better than her. Oh my God, I wish I looked as good as her. I judge myself against looking at other people. I have a bias of how I should look in a bathing suit. Anytime you feel a should or an ought to coming up inside your head when you're talking to yourself or thinking about someone else, that's your trigger to stop and think about, where did that bias come from? Where did I learn that bias? How is that bias helping me? Is that bias really keeping me safe? It's a chance to get self-aware, because as smart as our brain is, it's only able to protect us based on the information we give it. And if the information is on automatic rewind of a story you were told your entire life, and you found validation for those stories, then the only story you're ever going to see is the one that got created when you were very young. or that got reinforced in the world around you. The only way to change it, to really become bias aware, to consciously include others, is not to just say it's wrong, it's to look within and recognize, I'm holding some judgment here. Is that helping me? Is that hurting me? Is that going to give me the possibility for upside potential? Is it going to help me make connections with others? And if you're feeling at all lonely in the world today, wouldn't you love to know how to reduce some of the barriers to connecting with others? I know it's been valuable for me. So, in conclusion, be curious, not judgmental. That's the key, to be consciously included. And I love this quote from a professor at the University of Chicago: the only antidote to our self-protective mind-reading tendencies is to get curious and start asking more generous questions. Like, why do you feel that way? Or tell me more about that. Or I'm curious, I've never experienced that. What's that like? Generous questions that say, I have an open heart and I'm open to hear what's going on for you. Look at yourself first. See what you can do to become more aware and be more conscious to include others in all that you do. I'm going to move to questions and stop sharing my slides. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Great presentation. I really appreciate it. Yes, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear them. And Lisa, I have a couple of questions for you. First one, what should I do if I see someone being excluded?
Yeah, it's a really good question and one of my favorite questions, because we feel like we have to run in and save, or we worry about our own safety. So safety is critical, but depending on the environment where you see it happening, you can come right in and offer generous or curious questions. So let me give you an example, because I think answering questions is always better with a story. So I remember being excluded from something at one point in my career, and I got all indignant and judgmental about it. And all I did was form more judgments about the people who had excluded me. When in reality, if just one person had said, wait a second, what about Lisa? I would have felt included and that judgment would have stopped. So if you can just speak up and say, whose voice isn't in the room? Who's being left out? Or if you see someone being left out, say, wait a second, guys, there's a couple people over there. Let's see if they can join too before we go and do anything.
Great.
That's really useful.
Thank you, Lisa. Another question. In creating an inclusive environment, is there a danger in making diverse members feel singled out for their differences? That's from Mary.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I love that question. So there could be, depending on your approach. So if what you're trying to do is say, oh, I noticed Mary is different and we'd really love to have the African-American voice in the room. Mary, can you speak up? That's incredibly isolating and it's a whole lot of pressure. So when we go about consciously including, it's a matter of stepping in and saying, I'm happy to answer that question. I'm curious if anybody else has an opinion about it. Mary, I noticed I hadn't heard from you. So there's a way to make it sound more inclusive. I want to hear from everyone, and I haven't heard from everyone. Is there anybody else who has something they want to share? And it's always okay to check in after the fact. I noticed you didn't speak up at all in the meeting. Is there anything I could have done to make it more comfortable for you? Simple ways you can follow up. But I agree, the question is phrased incredibly well because it can feel so isolating. Like when people say, oh, like I was in a group of people recently and they said, oh, she's deaf when they pointed to me because I am pretty significantly hearing impaired. And I remember feeling like all eyes were turned on me and I was the different person in the room, where what would have been more helpful is to say, could you all just one person speak at a time? It would be helpful for me, and I'm sure for anyone who's hard of hearing. So those are also ways you can do it. Generalize it so that you're not embarrassing anyone.
Thank you for those great examples. One other question. What should I do if I feel I'm being excluded?
Yeah, that's a good one. You know, like I gave in my first example, we tend to go straight to judgment of other people or judgment of ourselves. I guess I'm not good enough. I guess I should show up differently. And that really just keeps the connection separated. It keeps the differences going, and it leaves out the ability to make a human connection. So what's really key is to be really self-aware. What is it I want in this moment? What is it I really am looking for? And so in my very first example, when I was left out, I know I could have said, I would love to come, but I'm on daycare duty. Is there any way we could do it tomorrow after work instead? And I didn't feel comfortable enough to say that. I was the only woman. I was the only one rushing home to her kids. And I didn't feel comfortable. So what felt comfortable was judging them for being bad fathers and husbands and not going home to their wives, mothers of their children. And that felt easier for me. But you know what? It kept me from making a connection. So if we can get clear, how are we feeling and what do we really want? We can decide whether or not to act up. And if you're in a workplace setting, you see people are doing something, or even in the club that you all are involved with, if you see something that you want to participate in, speak up and ask for what you want, because no one's going to be able to read your mind. They don't know that you're hoping to be part of this.
Thank you. Let's see, you've got a compliment here. This is one of the most interesting webinars I've attended. Bridget says, she thanks you. And she says, I appreciate understanding the origins of bias and seeing it from a human vantage point. And the video really made an impact of unchecked bias. So she thanks you for that.
It's my pleasure. It's really my passion work, because here's the thing that people don't realize. We think that overcoming bias is going to make other people feel better, but what we don't realize is how much better we'll feel about ourselves. And when we crack our heart open to let go of some of that self-judgment, we open a connection to other people. And when we let go of judgment of others, bias, we open a potential connection. Now, are you going to get along with everyone? No. And you don't have to. And can you still surround yourself with people who are like you? Yes, absolutely. But if you really want to work on creating the kind of world where all human beings are able to connect with one another, if you're really interested in making a difference, if you feel excluded and want to be part of, or you feel like your group isn't diverse and you would really benefit from it, then start with the self-awareness. Figure out how you were conditioned and notice. Favorite advice? Notice when you feel yourself rolling your eyes. Because I guarantee you've done it with politics or something in the press, and you thought, I can't believe that person said that. Stop and say, where's that coming from? What's my value set? What's really happening here? So that you can put yourself in check and check where your bias is coming from.
Great. We have a question from Nancy. She says, so many times at a social event, I find folks talking in small groups, and when I approach a group, they don't turn to include me or tell me what they're talking about. What do you recommend to someone in that situation?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. It's so hard because we can't make everybody want to be consciously inclusive, right? Like we can't make everybody behave that way. So my advice is, why do you want to connect with them? What are you hoping to connect with them on? And enter with that. Hi, I'd like to know what you were all talking about, but you all seem to be having a lively discussion here. Is it okay if I join? Something that recognizes I'm interested in being a part of this. Now, I can't guarantee that that's always going to go over well. We have a lot of work to do. So what I'd also offer is extend that grace to someone else. If you felt that, keep an eye open for the person who seems to be left out and approach them and ask, hey, how are you doing? I noticed you standing over here by yourself. My name's such and such. And that's how you can make social events change, by being a role model and example of what inclusion looks like.
Great. And another question, what if people choose to be excluded, even when they're invited to join?
Yep. And you know what? They may. And, at some point I've excluded myself because I was overwhelmed by the noise and the sound and too frustrated. It's totally fine if somebody says, no, I'm good, I'd rather just be out here on my own. If you find yourself judging them for not accepting your invitation, go back to step one and self-awareness, because really we all have a choice of how we want to live this life. And if someone wants to choose to do it on their own for a while, okay, no problem. But if you're looking for company, I'm free. I'd love to spend time with you. Just let them know you have an open heart and the willingness to share it with them.
Great. From another Mary, just yesterday, 2 professional men who are part of the same professional organization as I am, who I had never met, when I introduced myself, they said, are you the new administrative person?
Mm-hmm.
I have been part of the organization for 20 years, and both of them were new. I didn't know how to respond, but simply said, I've been a member for 20 years. And I felt I could have said something differently to raise awareness. Do you have any suggestions for Mary?
Yeah. Oh, God, I'm so sorry that happened to you, Mary. How painful. And I think you handled it fine. I think the next time it's okay to have somebody else introduce you so that they lead up to it. But you can always introduce yourself by saying, welcome to the organization. We haven't met yet. Here's what I do. So that they don't have time to make a judgment. You can put it right out there. And for me, I'll use my example again. I tell people right up front that if we're in an in-person setting and they're crumpling paper or eating, I won't be able to hear them. Or if they're sitting on my right, I won't be able to hear them. And I've learned how to make it kind of funny. And I always tell people to my right, if I lean close to talk to you, I'm not trying to kiss you. I just need to turn so I can hear you. And they usually get a giggle out of that. So feel free to come up with whatever kind of saying works for you. But in a predominantly male organization, I've seen that story before, and I'm sorry it happened to you.
Any other questions? Feel free to type them in the QA section.
I will be happy to send the video to you, Lori, so that you can share that with anyone who's interested, as well as the TED Talk I mentioned by Brene Myers. So I'll do both of those.
So I think we've come to the end of our great time. Is there anything else you wanted to share?
I just want to really thank all of you for your time, your interest, and your attendance today. I think the key here is to want to show up differently, and the fact that you showed up tells me you do. So thank you so much, and I hope that I've offered you some way to look at the world a little bit differently.
Thank you, Lisa. You gave us a wonderful presentation. I think everybody was moved by it and interested in it, so thank you so much. As we end our session today, I'd like to tell our audience that the Outdoor Art Club's next speaker will be on Thursday, October 12th at 1 p.m. We're going to feature Christine Yu, who is a filmmaker, and she's going to discuss her film 26.2 to Life, about the transformative power of an annual marathon that takes place at San Quentin prison. So you can register for this and all future webinars at the Outdoor Art Club by going to our website, outdoorartclub.org, and look under public events. And if you want to hear more about other events, you can sign up on our mailing list at the same place. Go to outdoorartclub.org under public events page, and there's a place for you to put in your email so that we can contact you about future public webinars. We thank you again for everyone joining us today, and we hope that we'll see you again very soon.